The barn door screamed when it opened, a sharp metal cry that sliced through the quiet afternoon and made dust rise like something waking up. Sunlight spilled in thin gold lines, catching on floating hay and rusted nails, and that's when she saw him. A dog sat in the far corner, pressed against the wall, as if he were trying to disappear into it. His ribs showed with every breath. His fur was dull, matted with old straw and fear. He didn't bark or run. He just watched her, eyes wide and glassy, trembling so hard the rope around his neck shook. Her fingers tightened around the door, heart pounding, because the rope wasn't tied to anything anymore. It had been cut. Hanging from it was a small folded note, creased and dirty, swaying slightly as he breathed. The air smelled like old wood and abandonment. She took one step forward, then stopped, a strange ache blooming in her chest. In that moment, she didn't know why he was here, only that someone had walked away from him, closed this door, and left him to wait. The barn smelled like old summers and forgotten things, the kind of place time had stopped visiting years ago. Light slipped in through cracks in the wooden walls, thin and pale, laying itself gently over the floor like it was afraid to disturb what lived there. She stood just inside the doorway, one sneaker half on dirt, half on splintered wood, her small fingers still wrapped around the cold metal handle. The noise the door had made lingered in her chest, echoing long after the sound itself died. That was when she saw him properly, not as a shape or a shadow, but as a living thing that had been waiting too long. The dog was pressed into the corner where the wall bowed inward, his body curved around itself as if he were trying to take up less space in the world. His breathing was fast and shallow, every rib visible, every inhale a question of whether it would be followed by another. His eyes locked onto hers, wide and dark and shining with something close to panic. But underneath it there was exhaustion, the kind that comes from being scared for too long. He didn't growl, he didn't bark, he just trembled, the rope around his neck vibrating softly with the movement of his fear. Her heart began to beat differently then, slower and heavier, like it knew something important was happening. She took a step forward, then stopped, unsure if the sound of her shoe on the floor would be too much. The air felt thick, loaded with dust and silence, and she could hear her own breathing, loud and uneven. The rope around his neck wasn't tied to anything. That was the part that hurt first. Someone had untied him. Someone had made a choice. The note hung from the rope, folded and dirty, its edges softened by time and movement. It swayed gently as the dog breathed, brushing against his chest like it was trying to remind him it was still there. She didn't reach for it yet. Something in her knew that once she read it, nothing would be simple again. For now, all she could think about was how alone he looked, how the barn seemed too big for one small, frightened dog, and a little girl who hadn't planned on finding anything at all that afternoon. She lowered herself slowly onto her knees, the wood creaking beneath her weight. The sound made the dog flinch, his body shrinking further back, paws pulling closer to his chest. Her throat tightened. She stayed where she was, hands resting flat on her legs, palms open. She didn't know why she did that. It just felt right, like showing him she wasn't holding anything that could hurt him. Her eyes never left his face. His gaze never left hers. Outside, the wind moved through the fields, brushing against the barn walls, whispering through the cracks. Somewhere far away, a tractor engine hummed, steady and indifferent. Life was continuing at its usual pace, completely unaware that something fragile was unfolding in this forgotten place. She wondered how long he had been there, how many times he had heard footsteps that never came closer, how many times he had hoped the door would open and then stayed closed. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered, though her voice barely made it past her lips. She wasn't sure if dogs understood words like that, but she hoped they understood tone. The dog's ears twitched at the sound, his head tilting slightly, confusion mixing with fear. He didn't move toward her, but he didn't pull away either. It felt like progress, even if it was only a breath wide. She crawled forward inch by inch, stopping every time his body tensed. Her knees picked up dust and splinters, but she didn't notice. All she could see were his eyes, the way they tracked her carefully, like he was memorizing her movements just in case he needed to run. When she was close enough, she finally reached out, not to touch him, but to the note. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. The paper was thin, worn soft, the ink slightly smeared. She read the words slowly, her lips forming them without sound, and something inside her chest cracked open. It wasn't anger she felt first. It was sadness, deep and heavy, the kind that sinks instead of burns. She looked back at the dog, at the way his tail lay still against the floor, at the way his eyes searched her face, and she knew, with a certainty that scared her, that he wasn't just abandoned. He was waiting. Getting him out of the barn took longer than she expected. Not because he fought her, but because he didn't believe her. Every step toward the door felt like asking him to rewrite something carved deep into his body. When she stood and backed away, holding the rope loosely, he stayed where he was, eyes darting to the open doorway as if it were a trap instead of an exit. Sunlight pooled there, bright and unfamiliar, and he shrank from it like it might burn. She waited. Time stretched thin. Dust settled again. Finally, she sat back down on the floor, closer than before, but not close enough to corner him, and tugged gently on the rope. Not a pull, just an invitation. Her arm began to ache, but she didn't move. She talked to him instead, softly, about nothing important at all. About the sky being blue today, about how her mom would be wondering where she was, about how she liked dogs, even though she'd never had one. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied, finding a rhythm that felt like safety. Something shifted. It was small, almost invisible, but she felt it. The dog leaned forward, just enough for the rope to slacken. His paws slid across the floor, nails scraping lightly against the wood. He paused after every step, flinching at his own courage, but he kept going. When he finally crossed the threshold into the sunlight, he squeezed his eyes shut, body rigid, bracing for something that didn't come. The walk home was slow. He stayed close to her leg, pressing into her like she was the only solid thing left in the world. Every loud sound made him jump. Every passing car sent his tail tucking tight. She adjusted her pace to his, stopping whenever he froze, kneeling to his level, and waiting until his breathing slowed again. People passed them without looking twice. To the world, he was just a skinny dog and a little girl walking home late. No one could see the weight of the note folded in her pocket, or how it seemed to get heavier with every step. Her mother's face shifted the moment she saw them. Confusion, then concern, then something like fear. Words came fast, questions piling over each other, but the girl couldn't answer right away. She just stood there, one hand gripping the rope, the other resting on the dog's back. His fur was coarse under her palm, uneven but warm. Her mother knelt down slowly, eyes softening when she saw his ribs, the way he leaned into the girl without even realizing it. Inside the house, everything felt too loud, too bright. The dog stayed near the door, pacing, nails clicking against the floor, eyes scanning every corner. He didn't eat the food they offered at first. He just sniffed it, then backed away, watching it like it might disappear if he trusted it. That night he didn't sleep. Neither did the girl. She lay on the floor beside him, blanket pulled around her shoulders, listening to his breathing rise and fall in uneven waves. When morning came, her mother unfolded the note. They read it together at the kitchen table, sunlight pouring through the window, dust dancing in the air. The words were simple, apologetic, written by someone who loved him enough to leave him somewhere they thought he might be found. Someone who had run out of choices, not love. By the time they finished reading, the girl's eyes burned and her mother had gone very still. The days that followed were quiet, careful. The dog learned the shape of the house, the sounds of it, the way the floor creaked near the stairs, and how the refrigerator hummed at night. He flinched when hands moved too fast. He startled at raised voices. But he stayed. He ate a little more each day. He followed the girl from room to room, lying near her feet like he was afraid she might vanish if he blinked too long. Trust didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in the way he let her touch his head without ducking, in the way his tail wagged once, uncertain, when she came home from school, in the way he slept deeper when she was nearby. And every time he chose to stay instead of run, something in her settled, like she was learning how to hold pain without dropping it. By the end of the week, he had a name again. It felt important, like proof that he belonged somewhere. And though none of them said it out loud, they all understood the same thing. Whatever had been lost in that barn wasn't gone forever. It was just beginning to find its way back. Healing did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine. Mornings began with the soft sound of paws moving across the floor, hesitant at first, then more certain as days passed. He learned where the sunlight landed in the living room and chose that spot every time. Curling into it like warmth was something he had once been denied and would not risk losing again. The girl learned his rhythms just as carefully. She learned that sudden laughter made his ears flatten. that the clatter of dishes sent him retreating under the table, that raised hands, even playful ones, made his body stiffen before his mind could catch up. She stopped running in the house. She stopped slamming doors, not because anyone told her to, but because she saw what it did to him. In that way, he taught her a new language, one made of pauses and gentleness and paying attention. When she sat with him, she kept her movements slow, her voice low. She let him come to her instead of reaching for him. Some days he didn't, and she learned that loving him meant respecting that too. Nights were the hardest. When the house went quiet and shadows stretched long across the walls, he paced. His nails clicked in nervous patterns, his breathing quickened, and sometimes a low whine slipped out before he could stop it. She would wake to the sound and sit up immediately, heart racing, as if his fear had become her own. She never scolded him. She just whispered his name into the dark over and over until the sound of it seemed to anchor him back to the room. Once, during a storm, he panicked so badly he knocked over a chair trying to hide. Thunder cracked the sky open, rain slamming against the windows like fists, and he trembled uncontrollably, eyes wild, searching for somewhere to disappear. The girl wrapped her arms around him before she could think better of it, pressing her face into his neck, her own body shaking just as hard. For a long moment, neither of them knew if it would help or hurt. Then his breathing began to slow, syncing with hers, as if they were reminding each other how to exist. School became something she rushed through instead of lingered in. She came home faster now, backpack bouncing against her spine, heart lifting every time she saw him waiting by the door. Sometimes his tail wagged, sometimes it didn't, but he always came, and every time he chose her, something inside her grew steadier, stronger, like she was learning how to be someone safe. Her parents watched it happen quietly. They noticed how the dog began to fill out, how his coat slowly lost its dullness, how his eyes softened. They noticed how their daughter spoke with more care, how she listened more than she talked, how she seemed older somehow, waited with an understanding that hadn't been there before. They didn't rush anything. They knew now that this wasn't just about saving an animal. It was about letting two wounded things find balance in each other. One afternoon, she found him sleeping on her bed for the first time. He was curled tightly at the edge, as if still unsure he was allowed there. She stood in the doorway for a long time, afraid to breathe too loudly. When she finally sat beside him, he didn't move. He just let out a long, deep sigh, the kind that sounded like letting go. Tears pricked her eyes without warning. She brushed them away quickly, embarrassed even though no one was watching. The note stayed folded in a drawer, but its presence lingered. Sometimes she thought about the hands that had written it, the voice behind the apology. She wondered if that person lay awake at night too, imagining him alone in the dark. The thought made her chest ache, complicated and heavy. Love, she was learning, didn't always look the way stories promised. Sometimes it looked like leaving when staying would break you both. By the end of the month, he no longer flinched when she laughed. He slept through most nights. He trusted the food bowl enough to eat without watching the door. And when she cried once quietly, over something she didn't yet have words for, he climbed into her lap without hesitation, resting his head against her chest like it was the most natural place in the world. They were still learning each other's shadows, still careful, still fragile, but something unspoken had taken root between them, something stronger than fear. Not a promise that nothing bad would ever happen again, but a promise that whatever did, they would not face it alone. The call came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that feels too calm to carry bad news. The dog was asleep at her feet, belly rising and falling in a slow, trusting rhythm, his paw twitching as if he were chasing something gentle in a dream. The girl was on the floor with her homework spread around her, pencil tapping softly against the page. When the phone rang, the sound cut through the room like a snapped wire. The dog's head lifted instantly, eyes alert, body tensing before he even understood why. Her mother answered quietly in the kitchen. The girl could hear the low murmur of her voice, careful and measured, the way it sounded when she was choosing her words too slowly. She tried to keep working, but her chest tightened. The dog stood and padded toward the doorway, ears pricked, something restless moving through him, like memory waking up before logic could stop it. When her mother returned, her face had changed. Not fear exactly, something heavier. She sat down across from the girl, folding her hands together, eyes drifting briefly to the dog before coming back. The girl felt the moment stretch, thin and fragile, and suddenly she knew. not the details, but the shape of it. The past had found them. The note had a name on it, a phone number barely legible. Someone had finally called back. The words fell slowly, each one landing like a weight. The man who had left the dog in the barn had been sick. Not a passing illness, but something that hollowed you out from the inside, something that made simple things impossible. He had loved the dog for years. He had tried to find help. Shelters were full. Friends were gone. Family was complicated. The barn had been the last place he could think of where the dog might be seen, might be saved. He hadn't wanted to abandon him. He had wanted him to live. The girl's hands curled into fists without her noticing. The dog paced now, circling the room, nails clicking faster and faster, his breathing shallow. It was like he could feel the conversation turning sharp, like the air itself was beginning to fracture. When her mother mentioned the possibility of meeting the man, of talking about what should happen next, the dog stopped moving altogether. He stood perfectly still, head low, eyes fixed on the floor. That night he didn't sleep. Neither did the girl. She lay awake, listening to him pace, her heart pounding in time with his steps. Every sound felt too loud. Every shadow felt like a warning. She reached out from her bed and whispered his name, but it didn't soothe him the way it used to. He stood by the door for hours, staring at it like it might open on its own. The days that followed were heavy with waiting. The man was coming to visit, just to see him, her mother said, just to make sure he was okay. The girl nodded and said nothing, but her chest burned with a fear she didn't know how to say out loud. She watched the dog closely, noticing how he startled more easily again, how he flinched when strangers passed the house, how he began sleeping curled tight instead of stretched out. When the car finally pulled into the driveway, the dog knew before anyone else did. His body stiffened, tail tucking, ears flattening against his head. He let out a sound she had never heard before, low and broken, like something torn loose from deep inside him. She dropped to the floor instantly, arms wrapping around his neck, face pressed into his fur. The man who stepped inside moved slowly, like every motion cost him something. His eyes filled the moment he saw the dog. He didn't reach for him. He just knelt down, one hand shaking, voice barely steady as he spoke his name. The sound of it hit the dog like a memory slamming back into place. He froze, torn between running and staying, between fear and recognition. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then the dog took a step forward, imper, then another. His body trembled violently as he reached the man, sniffing him, pressing his face into familiar hands. The girl felt something inside her break open completely. She didn't pull him back. She just watched, tears blurring everything, as love and loss collided in the space between them. The decision wasn't made that day. It didn't need to be. But the girl understood something then, something painful and true. Rescue wasn't about possession. It was about carrying what someone else could no longer hold. And sometimes loving meant standing still while your heart begged you to run. The house felt different after that visit, like the walls had absorbed something and were still deciding what to do with it. The dog slept more in the days that followed, exhaustion finally overtaking the tension that had lived in his body for so long. When he dreamed, his paws twitched and his breathing quickened, but he no longer paced the halls at night. Instead, he chose the space between the girl's bed and the door, a quiet compromise between guarding and staying close. No one rushed the choice. Her parents spoke softly in the evenings, voices low and careful, as if the wrong tone might fracture something already fragile. The man called once more, his voice tired but gentle, asking how the dog was eating, if he was sleeping, if he seemed happy. The girl listened from the hallway, fingers curled around the edge of the wall, heart pounding. She waited for the moment she would be told goodbye was coming. But it didn't come the way she feared. The man admitted what his body already knew. He couldn't give the dog what he needed anymore. Love had never been the problem. Capacity had. Saying the words didn't make it easier, but it made them honest. When her mother hung up the phone, her eyes were wet, and she pulled the girl into a long embrace that smelled like soap and warmth and something close to grief. The girl didn't celebrate. She sat on the floor beside the dog and pressed her forehead to his, breathing him in. He licked her cheek once, slow and deliberate, like a promise made without language. In that moment, she understood that nothing had been taken. Something had been entrusted. Life didn't become perfect after that. He still startled sometimes. Loud noises still made his muscles tense. There were days when the shadow of the barn seemed to flicker behind his eyes, but there were also mornings when his tail thumped against the floor before she even spoke. Afternoons when he chased leaves across the yard, ears flying, body light in a way she had never seen before. Nights when he slept sprawled across her bed, completely unafraid of taking up space. The barn still stood at the edge of the fields, weathered and quiet. Once months later, she walked past it with him at her side. The door was open now, light filling the space where fear had lived. He paused at the entrance, body still, nose lifting to the familiar scent of old wood and dust. She waited, heart in her throat, ready to stop, ready to turn back if he needed to. He stepped forward. Just a step. Then another. He sniffed the floor, the walls, the corners where shadows once pressed in too tightly. His tail wagged, hesitant but real. After a moment, he turned back to her, eyes bright, and walked out again without looking back. She laughed then, the sound bursting out of her chest, surprised and free. Years later, when people asked where he came from, she never said of the barn. She said he came from waiting. From loving someone who couldn't stay. From being brave enough to trust again. Sometimes, late in the evening, she would think about the note. About the hands that had tied it so carefully, hoping someone kind would read it. She hoped the man knew his dog was safe, that his love hadn't ended in that dark corner. She hoped he knew it had carried on, just in a different form. The dog grew older, his muzzle grayed, his steps slowed, but he never forgot her. Even on his last day, when the world grew quiet and his breathing softened, he pressed his head into her hand the way he had the first night, grounding himself in her presence. When he was gone, the house felt emptier, but not hollow. Love had passed through it and left its shape behind. And sometimes, when the wind moved just right and dust lifted into the light, she thought of a barn door opening, of fear turning into trust, of how some rescues don't end when someone is found. They end when what was broken learns how to stay.